20 years ago, Microsoft almost made an acquisition that would have changed Xbox forever. It's a bit hard to believe that Xbox, the brand that launched on stage with The Rock and Bill Gates pulling back the curtains, or the cloth, I guess, if you will, is 20 years old. The original Xbox with the Duke and everything that we loved about it is it's 20 years old. There's no other way to describe it. And my friend over at Bloomberg, Dina Bass, did a wonderful write-up talking about the history of the launch. And she did some good interviews that is linked down below. And I really, really recommend that you go read this because there's a lot of details in there and I'm not going to pull the whole thing or even most of it. There's just one aspect that I want to point out, and it's Microsoft and its acquisitions. So back when Microsoft was starting to build out the console, it was a significant challenge, right? You can't just build a console. You need a lot of things. You need, the console, you need IP, meaning games, you need marketing, you need a whole bunch of stuff. So to spin up a business unit like this was a big deal. And it went all the way up and came from Bill Gates on the top down. And there was a bunch of sort of infighting because some people know this, but back in the day, meaning around this time, if Microsoft wanted to launch something new, they oftentimes put two teams that go out and, create the pitch that you can, the best pitch that you can. We'll come back, we'll fight to the death, and one of you will win, and then that product line will actually go off and ship. It's really not good for the culture of a company, but it was working for Microsoft at the time, and there were two consoles or two pitches for building at consoles. One was a completely custom solution, much like we're kind of accustomed to back in the day with consoles, and then there was one that was more of a Windows PC that was just running games. And so you know which one won because Microsoft is Windows and Bill Gates sees a Windows box running games, and that's the one he's going to choose, and he did. Fun fact is that it really didn't end up running Windows at the end of the day. But moving on from there, once they got the path that they were going to take, and yes, there were a lot of troubles getting there, they had to go out and try to get IP. And this is where Microsoft was like shopping around. I mean, Microsoft at this time had a lot of money, right? And they weren't as big as they were today, but a lot of the companies like EA were not nearly as large as they are today. And Microsoft actually went to EA and said, hey, we would like to buy you. And they weren't really too keen on it. And actually, EA really wasn't warmed up to Xbox at all. Initially, they were not wanting to support it. The reason being is that Microsoft at that time, and they still do today, I think you could argue, has a history of sort of dipping their toes into things. And if it doesn't work out, they just pull back. I mean, you could look at Windows Phone, you could look at Zune, you can look at some other initiatives, or the band, can't forget that one as well. And EA was a much smaller company, and for them to build or invest into building a game for the Xbox console for launch was a pretty significant endeavor, and they weren't convinced that Microsoft was going to go all in and be the juggernaut that they are today. So there's a little bit of awkward history there. More fun fact about that EA was initially not really loving Xbox Live either in that downloadable content model, which is hilarious in hindsight considering how much they love microtransactions, but EA said no. And actually, they went to Square, who was building Final Fantasy. I think we all know how that shaked out. And Microsoft could not buy them either. They were sort of desperate to get content. And that's sort of a longer version about how they end up with Bungie, who was having some financial issues. Bungie eventually joined. But the more interesting one is actually Nintendo, because Nintendo, if they could have bought them, that would have completely changed the course of the Xbox history, right? We know that Microsoft has struggled at times, and I think they're going to rectify that here in the next couple years with first-party titles. They've done some good acquisitions in the past few years, but there was definitely a drought, especially in the early Xbox One days, and even potentially throughout the longer generation. But if they would have had Nintendo, which has a wonderful history of producing high-quality games, that would have changed everything for them. So Steve Ballmer actually made Kevin Backus go meet with Nintendo to see if they would consider being acquired. And this is his words. He said, they just laughed their butts off, improvising there, they just laughed their butts off at us. Like, imagine an hour of somebody just laughing at you. That is kind of how the meeting went. Microsoft's pitch to Nintendo was that you could build the software and we would build the hardware. Microsoft is like, look, Nintendo, your hardware compared to the PlayStation is way underpowered. It's just not the same speed. Sony is kicking your butt. We can build high-end hardware and you can put your games on it and that will be the relationship and we'll just, buy you guys out, which is somewhat hilarious in hindsight as well, because to this day, Nintendo hardware is never known for being extremely powerful. It's always been, just kind of average specs, nothing crazy, but it's always had a good price price point, and they've always had even better first-party titles. The same thing that Microsoft was pitching to Nintendo 20 years ago, that they said, your hardware's not good, but your software's great, is what we still somewhat hear today. Although I think they've really figured out the hardware side from that casual gaming perspective, and Nintendo has done a wonderful job of cementing their place in the gaming community. But it's just interesting to see how those pitches and how we still think about these companies hasn't really changed, because as we know, the Xbox Series X is the most powerful console on the market. There's no arguing that. It just is. And Nintendo's is completely underpowered compared to that. But at the same time, Nintendo is cleaning up because they can really build IP and they know exactly what they were doing. And nothing has really changed since then. And so it's an interesting look at how Microsoft was trying to get up off the ground with the original Xbox. I almost said original Nintendo there. They were looking to buy companies. They're still in that mindset. Microsoft is still very cash rich. They have a ton of money in the bank. They are very good at going out and just snatching up companies because they have the cash flow to do it. We know that Bethesda is going to be closing here sometime in 2021. There's also other titles or other companies that they're looking at going to be acquiring here this year. But, spinning back that wheel of time back 20 years, I think it was really hard to imagine how Xbox would evolve. Because you got to remember, they were initially projecting they were going to lose billions of dollars on the original Xbox. Not many companies can afford to do that. And they also had a crazy high failure rate of like 20 to 25% of some of the initial units. There's a stat in there where they talk about how they had to take apart something like 200,000 consoles and put a little piece of felt in there because they were scratching the drives. And it's also funny too, because one of the primary issues with the next gen consoles is that the DVD drive sometimes will chatter, and it looks like Microsoft, and it's more of an industry thing, still hasn't fully solved that little riddle because the same problems still keep popping up. But for Xbox, it was a very long arc to be able to get to where they are to today, to be pushing Game Pass and the like. And obviously we all know Philip Spencer was there during this complete time, not always working at Xbox, but he was definitely at Microsoft during this. And so then there's also talks about how Bill Gates went to Japan, and we all know what the infamous image is of him on, I believe it was a placemat holding the controller and a burger. And the history of the Xbox launch is really fascinating just from an internal perspective. We actually, I believe, had heard that Microsoft tried to buy Nintendo, but Nintendo's perspective was, at the time we had heard the initial news, and I think this was like 2 years ago, they said they said something to the effect of Microsoft doesn't really understand games. They understand hardware, but they don't understand games, which is still kind of relevant today, because if you think about it, Microsoft really understands hardware, and then we all know the software side of it. So 20 years ago, the Xbox launched, and Microsoft, I think it's fair to say, has found a home in the living room. They don't dominate the market probably like they hoped they would, because especially around the early 2000s when this thing was launching, Microsoft had a way of, like, when it went into a market, it just stamped on the ground and it just owned it. Now, they clearly were not able to do that in the Xbox world because the PlayStation outsold them, I believe, just about every generation. The 360 is a little much closer than, say, the Xbox One. The current generation, we still have a long, long way to go to fully understand, but it's expected that the PlayStation will outsell it. But Microsoft being in second place isn't a bad thing. They were still selling a lot of consoles. They've still proven that they are a gaming company, and if it wasn't for them getting up on stage and taking the risk with not so much The Rock, but Bill Gates investing in the console, that Microsoft wouldn't be in the position that it's in today. Not every acquisition is successful for Microsoft. They can't always buy everything they want, but they've made the right plays, and the Game Pass future that we talk about here a lot, and streaming, wouldn't have started without that original console.